Thanks for tuning in. Today's podcast is brought to you by SmartBridge. Are you tired of having to do tasks manually on your computer over and over again? RPA is here to save the day. SmartBridge is a Houston-based company with over 15 years of experience in numerous industries and is now leading the initiative with robotic process automation. Learn more at smartbridge.com/automation.
Hey guys, welcome to today's episode of Transform IT. This is Miraj Jiwani.
I'm Patrick Pauls.
And we've got a special guest, and he's our first repeat guest, I believe. It's George Danner. I don't know if you remember from season 1. We had him on
episode 4, if I remember correctly, and
Yeah.
we were talking about digital transformation.
Yeah, so...
Now, actually, just before we really get started and talk about what we're going to talk about today, which is robotic process automation, there are a couple things that you said in your original podcast that I wanted to discuss with you and follow up on, because it's been almost 2 years since we recorded that podcast. But first, for the few of you who do not know who George is, I wanted to give a little bit of a background. George is actually the author of 2 books. He has about, I don't mean to date you, but about 37 years of experience. He's done everything. I know you did a lot in data modeling, and basically the entire concept behind what you do is using technology to improve business in multiple aspects of multiple different businesses. Now, if I remember correctly, you've worked on basically every continent but Antarctica, in almost every single industry. And you have some exceptionally valuable knowledge from how would we describe it, down in the trenches, from actually being here and seeing technology develop over the past 37 years while you're assisting business.
Yes, I'll say, Patrick, that I'm certainly not the smartest guy in the room.
This room you are.
I've had a unique front row seat on lots of businesses all over the world, and that's really what I've dedicated my career to, which is being a student of business. What shape are they in? What do they look like? How do they work? What are their business models? I've been asking all these questions for a very long time, and I get some really unique and useful answers. And then most recently, I'm now trying to express some of those answers that I've heard out to a broader audience through the lens of my latest 2 books.
And if you didn't hear that, shameless plug, he did release his second book recently, which you can get on Amazon. We'll circle back a little bit later towards the end of the podcast and talk about that.
It's called The Executive's How-To Guide to Automation. You can check it out, and we'll have him explain where you can find all that later on. So obviously it's been 2 years since you've been on the podcast. There's a lot going on. You've obviously worked on a book and a lot of learnings and teachings that you can kind of share with us. So can you kind of give us a little background about what you've been doing for the past 2 years?
Well, sure. And I didn't really set out to write necessarily about automation.
Yeah.
What I set out to do was to continue my study of how businesses work, how they tick, what makes them work the way they do. I looked at failed businesses and I looked at great businesses all over the world. And what I've found in my conversations with senior leaders over and over and over again, they kept mentioning this word, automation. And I dug a little bit deeper into that in some of my conversations with them. And they said, I don't want to fire all my people. What I really want to do is, through automation, I want to do 2x or 3x or 5x or 10x.
Yeah.
What I did last year. So it's this relentless drive toward productivity, driven often by shareholders and owners who are constantly wanting their businesses to work better, faster, cheaper. We've done all the easy things. We picked all the low-hanging fruit, as it were. What we're now into is fundamentally recrafting, reimagining how businesses work. And that's by taking what humans often do, which in some cases can be rote and mechanical, and converting that into an algorithm so that now people are free to do the more creative tasks.
Yeah, that's really good. So has your definition or view on automation changed while you were on this journey from what you saw, say, 2 years ago?
Yes, it certainly has.
Yeah.
You know, I had the same mental model that most everyone has about automation. When you say that word, it conjures up this image in your brain of robots on a factory floor making cars, welding
Yeah.
cars together, putting on windshields and
Mm-hmm.
things like that. And we've had that form of automation
Yeah.
for a very long time. In fact, I even went back further into the 1760s when the steam engine was developed, and that gave rise to many forms of automation that we even see today.
Mm-hmm.
What's different, Mirage, about the last couple of years is the sphere of what is automatable.
Yeah.
Now, we used to think that the things that we can automate are, in fact, very repeatable, very mechanical, very simple tasks. But with AI, the advent of AI, and a whole host of other tools in a technology tapestry that we have, we're able to automate things that actually require judgment and reasoning. Those are things that are a whole different game,
Yeah.
if you will, when it comes to automation. I mean, there's a lot of talk today about self-driving cars. Think about the judgment that you have when you drove your car this morning to work.
Yeah.
All the little decisions you made, you probably made hundreds of decisions
Without even
in
knowing
that
it, yeah.
small space of time. Now, that is subject to algorithmic treatment where it wasn't even as recently as 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So before we get any further down the rabbit hole of this, like I said, I use the term RPA, or robotic process automation. Now, you just had a great description of the fact that this type of automation is not actual mechanical automation, even though the new term RPA actually would imply it to someone that hasn't actually looked at the definition. Now, you talked about the major difference over the past 300 years plus over the past 5 years. So is really the takeaway from that over the real change or the real shift here in this type of automation is that it can do not just complex calculations, but do continuous, constant feedback of more and higher, continually higher level calculations and decisions?
Well, that's right. It's much more comprehensive and sophisticated, where we can recreate manual processes. So things that humans do, now we can move that into the world of automation. And it really revolves, you mentioned RPA earlier, it really revolves around one core concept or idea, which is that of a digital twin. So whenever I have a system, it could be a human being, it could be an asset, it could be a machine, and I want to create a digital replica of it, that's really the first step toward an automated path. RPA is an example where we're essentially taking a human being, and that human being is charged with 50 sheets of paper.
Mm-hmm.
Each sheet of paper has a new hire on it. So now I've got to take that new hire and I've got to type in a web form. We have now hired this person, and here's their title, and here's their salary grade, and so forth. What we're essentially doing is creating a digital twin of that person who is entering that information.
Mm-hmm.
To the web application that's receiving that information, it doesn't know whether it's dealing with a human being or whether it's being tricked into dealing with an RPA algorithm, which is what RPA is. So I see RPA as a small stepping stone into the world of creating digital twins of all sorts of types and shapes and sizes and levels of sophistication.
Yeah. And the benefit of that is now that you have a twin, you can do all sorts of tests and experiments and see how far you can take that.
Well, certainly. I mean, digital twins can be copied for free.
Yeah.
They can be distributed. They work 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
They work at nanosecond speeds. There's lots of advantages to having digital twins.
Yeah.
And again, I don't want people to listen too closely to a lot of people out there who are writing about automation as this evil force trying to take our jobs away. Certainly jobs will change. There's no question about it.
Yeah.
But really it's about using digital twins, automatons, if you will, to take over tasks that humans formerly did in a very, very mechanical way, freeing them up to do more creative, knowledge-based tasks. I mean, if we're going to improve as an economy, if we're going to increase our quality of life, we have to get people away from these very mechanical, low-skilled jobs to much higher skilled jobs where they're doing a lot more thinking about the work they're doing than doing the work itself.
So kind of shift to where the humans are trailblazing the ideas and the machines are following up to do the actual grunt work.
Well, that's right. That's right. That's the way it should be.
Yeah.
And there will be
Makes
some
sense.
uncomfortable dislocations. I will absolutely admit to that. People will change jobs, and change is scary for everyone. But the overall trend toward automation is actually a positive one. It's a positive one for our economy. It's a positive one for workers, and it's certainly a positive one for those people who take up the technology banner and are out there actually applying automation.
So along with that line of thought, some of the basic things that people discuss with with automation is that it's going to really drive cost and prices down while increasing the quality potentially of manufactured goods and other type of goods and services. My real question is, with that being said, so you've seen in especially the last 20 years a lot of offshoring of both traditional jobs and intellectual labor to places like India, China, and even some nearshore stuff to Mexico and some other places to just overall drive the cost down. Do you think this type of automation, as it matures and as it grows, will help bring some of that? I'm not saying bring it back, but basically have the idea that, okay, instead of offshoring a good portion of what we're doing, let's create these digital twins, reduce the cost even further, and more or less keep everything in-house.
Well, you're absolutely right, Patrick. And I would say go ahead and go where you were about to go, which is this idea of reshoring some of our manufacturing. In fact, I am contemplating the next book as being an exploration of this question as to whether manufacturing will return to its two large bastions, which is the UK, where manufacturing arguably was really created, invented, and perfected after the steam engine.
Yeah.
And the United States, where there's a very strong manufacturing base, primarily pushed forward through the course of our two world wars.
Yeah.
That's a great question, and my belief is, well, why wouldn't it? Why wouldn't manufacturing reshore? If the cost advantage that drove you to move manufacturing away from centers like the United States and UK go away, then why wouldn't it come back? And I think what's going to happen, Patrick, is we will see the advent of more manufacturing in the United States and the UK. But when it comes back, it's not going to come back the same. So if you take a manufacturing facility in China, let's say, and that manufacturing capacity now shifts to the US, it's not like you lift it up off the ground in China and drop it into the US. It's going to come back in a very different form. It's going to be smaller, it's going to be lighter, it's going to be faster, and arguably it's going to be with fewer workers. Yeah. So I would really like to explore this whole idea of whether this trend is likely to continue. Now, like it or not, you may be against a reduction or an increase in trade barriers, or you may be for an increase in trade barriers. But step back from that as a scientist for a moment and see what effect those trade barriers in the U.S., I'm talking about, have had. It actually has spurred some increased domestic production in industries where we have slowed down our capacity, namely the steel industry and the aluminum industry. So we could argue a long time about the politics of all that, but the bottom line is that we are seeing the signs today of a ramp up in reshoring of manufacturing. The question is it going to continue? I believe that it will, but I would love to collect the empirical data behind that question and really give readers the sense of whether this is a strong trend or not.
And my only follow on to that is, and this is another big thing that I know has become increasingly an issue when people offshore is that intellectual property theft, recreation of that kind of stuff. And it looks like to me that if we have the ability to bring stuff back at the same or even a cheaper cost, and we can protect our intellectual property, or at least add some additional layers there, that may be another motivating factor in bringing it on, even if, like I said, the cost factors aren't 100% here and there.
Well, Patrick, I've spent a lot of time studying history in the last couple of years as I've been writing my books. And what I've found, going back to essentially the Italian Renaissance in the 1500s on through to the advent of the Industrial Revolution at the tail end of the invention of the steam engine, and then on forward into our modern capitalist area, what you see is these explosions of technological advancement when you have more than one technology all coming together. In the Italian Renaissance, you had the advent of the printing press that just so happened to coincide with the advent of better marine technology, building ships better, faster, cheaper. So now not only could you print a math book in Persia, but you could put that book on a ship and send it into Europe. In the era we're in now, you have a couple of very interesting technological trends around 3D printing. And 3D printing coupled with AI, coupled with other advanced manufacturing technologies, coupled with smart adaptive supply chains. You put all of those things together, and I believe that's going to lead to an explosion in onboard, onshore manufacturing capability, particularly in Western nations.
So is that a key major or like disruption that you see in the next 3 to 5 years? One of them?
I think there will be a few bold manufacturers who currently have lots of cement and steel in the ground, if you will, around physical facilities. And a very few of them are going to step forward and say, we're going to disrupt ourselves. We're going to destroy ourselves before the competition can do it. And they will start to create templates for what manufacturing is going to look like for the next 2, 3, 4 decades. And then others will follow their lead as that's successful. And I should point out that there's another class of folks who are on the sidelines watching all this very carefully, and that's investors.
Yeah.
People with money to invest in businesses that are going to grow and drive value. So they're looking very carefully at manufacturing, of all things, as a possible source of wealth going forward. You know, up to now, we've been worshiping technology, and I love technology. I'm a big fan, and I'm an investor. But can you imagine that things are sort of circling back to the whole idea of actually making stuff, actually making things back in this country? I don't know what's going to happen. I can't predict the future. I would love to do that. But what I can say is that there is evidence on the surface right now that we're on the cusp of a great explosion in manufacturing that's going to come to us in a very different form than we've ever seen before.
Are there any additional signals or signposts that you see that indicate that?
Well, you can drive through the Midwest, as I have done many times. And 10, 15 years ago, I would drive through the Midwest, and I saw a lot of decay and deterioration. This was really our Rust Belt in the true sense of the word. And now I'm seeing a lot of bright new signs and bright new buildings and repainted buildings and cars parked outside of these very large warehouses and industrial complexes. It's anecdotal, I know, but that gives me hope that a new manufacturing renaissance is upon us.
Yeah, the small things that can indicate that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So let's shift gears a little bit, because I don't want you to have to predict the future, as you said. You have given us a lot of good information, but I guess the real question we have, and one of the big takeaways we want to come from today is, okay, so we know that in some way automation is going to be a disruptor. We know that it's coming. The impact, the timing of the impacts, and what specifically is going to happen in what industry, that's all to be seen, and that depends on how the technologies develop. And I say technologies plural because, like you said, it's a culmination of multiple technologies instead of just this one. But what I want to know, and kind of go down in the weeds a little bit is that, okay, if we know this is coming, it's inevitable change that should potentially benefit most of us. What can we do to insulate ourselves or basically move and adapt with the time so it is a benefit instead of something that actually disrupts and or upsets our specific job / industry / companies?
Sure. So for any of those company leaders that are in our audience now, I hope they hear this message, which is the idea of getting ready now. All of our technology trends, if you again look at history, have shortened in their intervals, which means that automation is going to be upon us before we even realize it. And now we're sitting in a company. Maybe we have an industrial process where we chunk out plastic parts. That is prime to be disrupted. That wave is going to come to us somewhere in the span of about 3 to 5 years. We will be accepting greater and greater levels of automation, as you were outlining there, Patrick. What should companies be doing today? I've got a couple of ideas.
Yeah.
And I think my ideas will help them ease that transition into this dramatically automatic kind of future that we have. The first is around taking people and recrafting what those people do. I'm sure that every company has analysts inside their organizations. These are people who are problem solvers, tapped to solve hard problems, untangling a complicated, nasty supply chain, or figuring out how to price certain products. I mean, these are people who solve those day-to-day problems. Those are the perfect people who then can be repurposed around the idea of automation. Now, it's a tough question to ask a senior leader, hey, take these 10 people out of your organization, who, by the way, happen to be some of your best people, and turn them automatically into automation engineers tomorrow. Forget their day jobs. Let's have them do that. That's just not reasonable or practical. So I've been trying to get this idea across that I call sleeper cells. So this is taking people out of the organization temporarily, giving them automation-like skills, this technology tapestry that I referenced earlier. Give them those skills and then return them back to their home organization to wait there until such time as this automation wave is upon that company or that industry. That's certainly one thing that companies can do. The second thing that we've seen with automation is it's really interesting that automation is sort of a universal thing to do, activity to do. It cuts across lots of industries. So companies are not always good, industries are not always good about looking outside of their industry for innovative practices that are happening, either in technology or automation or elsewhere, and then creatively adapting those practices to their own industry. Companies are not good at that. And what I'm saying, you audience out there, is you better get good at that, because you're not going to have time to wait for your own local industry to show signs of higher levels of automation. You got to act quicker than that. And we see really great examples of best practice outside in all kinds of different industries. So one has to take a creative kind of mentality to that and be a student of business worldwide, industry-wide.
And so just coming back to the more professional services side, do you think that especially companies like yours, companies like ours that deal with professional services, do you think they'll see the same type of disruption that a lot of the manufacturing and actual product development companies will see, or do you think it will hit us differently, and how?
Well, I don't think any company anywhere, any industry anywhere will be untouched by the whole idea of automation. And I'll give you a couple of data points there. I mean, the FAA is talking about in some of their papers pilotless commercial air flight. So imagine that. You're getting on an airplane and there's no pilot. 70% of the plane is already automatically flown anyway.
A lot of people don't know that.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that. Now you do. So that's an industry that is, we thought, was completely insulated from this idea of automation. people are talking in academia about automated judicial proceedings. So you go to court and you argue your case not in front of a human judge, but in front of an algorithm that weighs the merits of your arguments and then decides whether you win or lose. That was also thought to be completely insulated from automation. So yes, Patrick, we're going to see automation find its way into professional services, into consulting, into advisory, into technology, into implementation. We're going to see all of those happen. I wish I had a crystal ball to tell you exactly how, but what I can say is that any activity that we do today where we can sit down and devise an intelligent algorithm that is the equivalent of that human activity, that is subject to disruption via automation. And I think arguably a lot of consulting is that way. The medical field is one of the prime examples of where this is happening. There are certain places where they are using machines to do diagnosis of patients. Why? Because human doctors have a lot of failings in that regard, in diagnosis. The patient that you saw last week looms larger in your brain than the patient you saw 2 years ago. Yet, the patient you saw 2 years ago might be more relevant to the patient you're seeing today.
Yeah.
So that's an example of temporal bias, and we're seeing those kind of biases all over the place. Now, I love my doctor, and I'm sure everybody in the audience, they love their doctors too. And doctors are a great thing. But Andrew McAfee, who is a great thinker in this regard from MIT, suggested that doctors really should be spending more time on patient compliance than they are on diagnosis. Patient compliance is one of the toughest issues in personal medicine these days. I could prescribe you, Mirage, some medicines. If you don't take your medicine, I can't really help you very well. So is it a better use of my time as a medical professional to work with you on your compliance to the medicines I've prescribed rather than something a machine does much better, which is diagnosis? I don't know the answer to that question. Medical ethicists really need to weigh in here.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting debate to have, which is what should doctors be doing? And what can doctors not do today? I mean, I asked my doctor, my own personal doctor the other day, when I went to visit him, I said, hey, do you ever spend much time with patients, making sure that they're taking their medicine, they're losing weight? And he hemmed and hawed a little bit, but the basic answer was, I don't have time to do that because I'm constantly diagnosing patients that come in my door.
Yeah.
So I think it's a legitimate question to kind of think about how all these kinds of things that heretofore we thought of as strictly human endeavor, consulting, the medical profession, the legal profession, flying airplanes, how could those be changed for the better in an automated future?
Well, one thing I can tell you is that with several interactions with doctors on my own, it's almost as much intuition and witchcraft as it is actual medical science. So if we can standardize that a little better, I think we could see some definite benefit from it.
Maybe we'll do a whole other podcast on that subject alone.
Yeah. We'll start a series.
So we've talked a lot about what could potentially happen and the market disruptions, how we can kind of insulate ourselves from it, or how we can adapt to this new technology. But what we really haven't talked about a lot is what kind of technologies are we going to be using to automate, and how do you see the actual automation coming in? So I'm not talking about what it's going to do, but I'm talking about the actual tools and technologies that people could or may be using to actually run the automation.
No, that's a great question. I mean, we have such a long list today of what I call the art of the possible. With technology, we can do pretty much anything these days. In fact, I would even go so far as to suggest that the range of technologies that we have at our disposal are outpacing the kind of hard problems that we're able to throw at it. So it's amazing. We are unlimited in our ability to apply technology to hard problems. But you raise a great question, Patrick, which is what are the specific technologies that are likely to rise to the top when one is thinking about going into an organization and automating it in surgical doses? There's a couple that come to mind. The first is natural language processing. also known as NLP. The reason NLP is important is because it serves as the last mile to the consumer of the intelligence. So when I want to know something, do I go to a computer to type in things to try to understand the answer to my question? No. I'd much rather just speak a question in my own language and get a sensible answer to my question. Natural language is one of the pieces of technology that helps to make that happen. So what we're going to start to see is automation in the form of human beings interacting with intelligent systems. NLP makes that work. The other thing I would mention is artificial general intelligence. Now, we've heard a lot about artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence is essentially forcing a piece of software to learn the correlation between a set of inputs and a set of outputs. Artificial general intelligence is a little bit different from that. It's actually having software systems learn what to learn. Google did some of this when they did their work with the Japanese game of Go and how to create a digital twin of a Go master, which is a master level player of that Japanese board game. It learned how to learn strategy. It was programmed to learn strategy. Japanese game of Go is about 5,000 years old. The kinds of strategies this bot was executing were strategies that the Go masters, the human Go masters, had never seen before. And they were beaten. So artificial general intelligence, AGI, is a phrase that I believe you'll be hearing in this whole automation lexicon going forward. Systems that learn how to learn. And finally, I would say an important technology is the notion of graph databases. We've had databases for many, many years, as long as we've had computers. We've been able to store data on them. And later on, after World War II, we started to look at database application software that was specifically designed to house data. We still have that today. Graph databases is the ability to store data in the form of a graph. A graph is a set of nodes connected by edges. A lot of people think a social network is a graph, and that is a correct definition. If you think of your circle of friends or your circle of family or your family and friends together, you're connected to your brother is connected to your mother is connected to your cousin and your cousin's friend and your cousin's barber, and so on. Those are all nodes in the network. And then the edges are the types of connection. You are my brother or you are my barber is a relationship connection. So imagine if we could store data in that form. Would it enable us to discover and understand and interpret things much better and faster than storing data in the traditional row, column, table kind of format? To give you kind of a humorous example of graph databases, many people who are big fans of the TV series Game of Thrones have created a graph database of all the actors and players in the Game of Thrones. I've never watched it, but I understand it's a complicated plot with lots of people coming in, going out, babies being born, people dying, new monsters being invented, every day. It's tough on the viewer to keep up with all that.
Yeah.
So what these folks have done is create a graph representation of that TV series. That's a great example of taking something that is a very unstructured form, natural form of data, and using an equally unstructured form to represent that data. So we're not artificially bending the data in order to store it reliably. So I'd say natural language processing, artificial general intelligence, and graph databases are a trifecta of technologies that are going to propel a lot of this automation forward.
Now, to graph databases, I've heard it a little. I've heard the term before, but I really, that's not something I've spent a lot of time studying or understanding. But when you have something like a graph database, would it be accurate to assume that you would have to have more of a AGI process in the background, being able to understand which edges to take and how that data relates to it, opposed to just being able to have some type of normalized database with some finite connections.
Oh, that's most definitely true, because when you have a graph database, you're not just loading data in a blind sort of way. You're actually curating that data. And that term curation is an important term. When we think of curation, we think of a museum director that takes these artifacts and carefully documents this bones of the dinosaur and then puts it away. That is a useful metaphor to think about how we load data into a graph database. One has to be highly skilled in information design and the corpus in which you're working in order to be a good curator of that information. So yes, it's a more deliberate process. It's a more thinking process. Presently, curating for graph databases is a largely manual effort. But a lot of the good work that's going on, lo and behold, is about how to automate a lot of this curation. Certainly not 100% these days, but it's driving closer and closer to that 100% automated curation.
It's really detailed, really, really good right there. So in terms of what we talked about so far, right? We talked about, we know that automation is coming. So the question is, again, how do we prepare for that, right? You gave 2 points. People who are in the day-to-day, they're intelligent, they can be repurposed around automation. And a way to do that is by enabling sleeper cells, as you call it, which is to take them, give them some skills, and then put them back until they're ready when that automation wave hits, right? And the second thing you talked about is looking universally outside of your own industry, learning from them instead of waiting for your industry to get that automation wave, right? We talked about that and the technologies. Is that correct? Or
yes,
yeah,
that's a very good summary of that. Yes.
Yeah, and then we talked about technologies that you just talked about, right? You just said natural language processing, artificial general intelligence, graph databases. So now, as leaders who are listening, what homework would you say we need to do besides like knowing and understanding, looking into these technologies? What homework do these leaders have to prepare?
By far the most important thing that senior leaders can do is to create version 2.0 of their companies. So if you take version 1.0, what does it look like? Often I walk into companies and I see how they work. They talk to me about their processes and their assets and their people and what they do and their various locations and their products. And so I make a pictorial representation of version 1.0 simply by observing and talking and asking lots of questions. I think senior leaders need to make that pictorial, either themselves or get help, but make a picture, an abstract representation of the version 1.0 of the firm. Now, once you have that faithful replica on a page, and believe me, there's just a healthy process that goes on, thinking process that goes on, when you take a company out of its real world equivalent and start to represent it on a piece of paper. That in and of itself is important work. But let's say we've done that. We've created version 1.0 of our firm. Then the important work becomes, what does version 2.0 look like? What does its business model look like? What does its asset profile look like? How many people does it have? What does its balance sheet look like? What does the P&L look like? What are the correct locations, physical locations for the firm? What are the right product lines? Version 2.0 is a shadow of version 1.0, but cast in this automated frame. So given the art of the possible, how can I reinvent, reimagine what the firm does? I've been through a lot of these facilitated processes where there's lots of blue sky talk, and that's great. I encourage companies to do that. But don't stop there. Don't stop at just the blue sky talk. Actually create pictorial representations of how the company functions, and then use that to inspire ideas about how to reimagine those functions. I mean, if Hilton Hotels had done this 5 years ago, could they have imagined Airbnb? If Yellow Cab had done this 10 years ago, could they have imagined something like Uber? I think the answer is yes, frankly. Go disrupt yourself before you have the unpleasant opportunity to be disrupted out from underneath you.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the strategy. You just talked about the strategy and how to how to go about that at a high level. Now I was wondering if you could kind of give us your suggestion on a couple of additional resources, whether it be websites or periodicals or books, things like that, that we can go look into to further our own knowledge. And at this point, a lot of us don't even know what we don't know yet, but so that we can get to that position where we at least have a general idea of the landscape.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's good work going on out there in automation. Tom Davenport is a very articulate writer about the subject of automation. I mentioned Andrew McAfee earlier as well. MIT is doing some really groundbreaking work thinking about automation, not just automation from a technology perspective, but automation from a business and strategy perspective. Also, I would suggest education. There are lots of great resources out there for education. I've been noticing quite a few boot camps out there under the heading of data science and analytics. In fact, this fall, I'm teaching my own boot camp at the University of Houston, the Business Analytics Boot Camp. We're going to touch on many of these issues. So those kind of resources are out there. They're just a Google search away from finding them. But those who are going to be successful in this automation era are those who are going to actively reach out, Patrick, to find those resources and use that to not only educate themselves, but to create a better awareness across the company. It's not sufficient simply for an automation mindset to take hold in 2 or 3 people in a company. It really needs to be broadcast throughout the entire organization because everyone is going to be impacted. So it's the combination of great books, like mine, of course. It's a combination of educational resources. It's also looking at where is the good thinking going on in academia. And there's some terrific quality materials in places like MIT and Carnegie Mellon and Stanford and others who are thinking about and writing about the topic of automation.
Perfect. So be sure to check that out, everyone who's listening.
Yeah. I guess the $10,000 question is, I asked you last time you were here, what was the most important thing you learned over the past 2 years? I want to ask you that same question again today because it's been almost 2 years since our last recording, and we've gone over a lot of tools, a lot of technology, but in your opinion, what is the most important thing you've learned in the past 2 years?
Well, as you know, Patrick, last 2 years I've been doing a lot of writing. My latest book was just released. So a lot of the research that I did was around this topic that was in my second book. I came into the topic of automation thinking, okay, automation's a good thing, and some companies are adopting it. Good to study it, good to know what it does. But at the end of the day, it's exactly that. It's yet another element in surviving in business. What I learned, though, Patrick, was that automation is not just a good thing, not just a thing to be studied and understood. It is absolutely vital for survival. I can't stop this wave of automation. You can't stop this wave of automation. Nobody in our audience can stop it. It is absolutely inevitable. So it is no longer just a nice thing to embrace automation. It is absolutely imperative. So I hope our audience sort of takes this as seriously as it is, a serious subject as it is, and actually not just comes up to the minimum level of automation, but actually embraces it and exploits it for strategic advantage. For many companies, that's going to bring them from what is an okay, good, ordinary company to a great, excellent, amazing, durable company. And I hope that for many of the people in the audience that they're able to thrive through this era of automation that's coming very, very soon.
Well, we'll leave it at that, I guess. Pretty straightforward. It's coming. You got to get ready. Thanks, George, again, for joining us today.
You're welcome.
It's always special to have you here. Again, if you like today's episode of Transform IT, go ahead and find us on social media and check out our SmartBridge blog at smartbridge.com/blog.
You give us a like and a share if you can also. I'm Patrick Pauls.
And this is Murad Juwani. And go out and create something exceptional with automation.